Hello, I'm Jackie Sholoman with Sholoman Group of Coldwell Banker Realty. Here today we are in the downtown Palo Alto office, and I'm with Mr. David Spence with Berner Cohen, estate planning attorney. So, David, tell us, what would you like to share with our viewers?
Thank you, Jackie. What I'd like to talk about today is a tax efficient method of selling one's home. So, here in Silicon Valley, we regularly have appreciated property. Maybe we bought it 20 years ago, it's doubled in value or tripled in value, and maybe it's time to sell a large home, downsize, and the problem with that is that you only get $500,000 of exemption from capital gain tax when you sell your home. And so, what I'm going to present today is a method whereby we can use the entire proceeds from the sale of your home to generate a retirement income, or part of the proceeds if that's your choice, but up to all of the proceeds. So that's what I'd like to talk about. What we have here is so the title of my presentation today is Downsizing into a Retirement Income by Using Charitable Remainder Trust. So the question is, what is a charitable remainder trust? Well, a charitable remainder trust is a tax exempt vehicle. It's a trust that is tax exempt under both the state and federal tax codes. And it is an entity that can sell an asset without paying taxes. And by doing that, we can preserve all of the proceeds from the sale of an asset like a home and do it in a very tax efficient way, therefore. So let's start with, how does one form a charitable remainder trust? Well, so step one to forming a charitable remainder trust is essentially you're going to just simply transfer your property by deed to the charitable remainder trust. Now, there are a couple of prerequisites to this. Number one, it is always going to be best, and in some cases required, that the property be tax-free. In other words, that the debt, any mortgage has been paid off. In certain unusual circumstances, we can work around some debt. But in most cases, the property has to be debt-free in order for this technique to work under the tax code. The other requirement prior to transferring the property to the charitable remainder trust is that you have to have moved out of the property. Now, you might be saying, well, what am I going to do? I got to live somewhere. Well, the way we typically do this is that you identify a buyer. But prior to accepting an offer for sale, you move out of the house. If you have to get temporary residence, that's okay. It can be well worth that little extra bit of hassle for you. But you have to have moved out of the house at the time that you commit to selling the house. And so typically, when my clients enter into a transaction like this, they'll put the house up for sale. They'll identify a buyer, find a buyer whose offer they want to accept. We'll have to work very closely with the real estate broker to make sure that the buyers understand that we'll be taking offers on one day, and then we'll be accepting offers. We give ourselves a few days, and we say we'll let you know when we accept offers. And so that will give time to move out of the property prior to accepting an offer. But that's step one, is simply prior to accepting an offer to sell, one has to move out of the house and transfer the house into the charitable remainder trust. Step two is that the charitable remainder trust sells the property to the third-party buyer and gets cash in return. This sale is a tax-free transaction because the charitable remainder trust is a tax-exempt entity under the code. Step one has certain tax benefits that we'll talk about. And step two has certain tax benefits that we'll talk some more about. But that's step one and step two. Then, now, what right now you're saying, well, what about me? I have a bunch of cash now in this charitable remainder trust, but it's not in my bank account. And the answer is that under the terms of the charitable remainder trust, the trust distributes income to you for the rest of your life. And the income can be defined in several different ways. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. And the income will be taxable to you under a method that I call WIFO, WIFO, which stands for worst in, first out. And what it essentially means is that to the extent there is income that has been stored up inside that charitable remainder trust, the character of that income when it's distributed to you will be whatever was stored up inside that trust. And if it's ordinary income from dividends or interest and that sort of thing, from investing the proceeds over the years, then it's going to be taxable to you first as dividends or interest and so forth. But primarily, it's going to be capital gain income that you'll recognize the income from as you receive these annual distributions from the charitable remainder trust. So there's steps 1, 2, and 3. Step 1 is the transfer of your property to the trust. Step 2 is the sale of your property to the third party buyer by the charitable remainder trust in exchange for cash. And step 3 is that the trust will then begin paying you an income stream for the rest of your life. The amount of that income stream is going to depend on a number of factors. First of all, the tax code puts several parameters on that income stream. Number one is that the present value of whatever's left when you die must be at least 10%. And number two is the income stream must be at least 5%. So those are the two boundaries. So we know that the income stream that you will receive will be at least 5% of the value of the cash inside the charitable remainder trust. And it very likely, depending on your age and therefore how long you are likely to live under the actuarial tables that the IRS uses, it could be significantly more than 5%. So that's steps 1, 2, and 3. And then when you die, whatever's left in that trust, and when I say you, I mean you and your spouse. So whoever the owners of that property were can get that income stream for the rest of their joint lives. So if it's a husband and wife, for example, the survivor will get the same amount that the two spouses got when both of them were alive. And so it just continues until the death of the second of them to go. But upon the death of the second of the spouses to go, or the one owner, if it was just one owner creating the trust, upon that person's death, whatever's left in that charitable remainder trust goes to your favorite charity, whichever charity you have selected. Now, we don't have to decide exactly upon who the charity will be at the time we create the trust. We might retain the right to name a charity at a later date. We might name a charity and retain the right to change the charity at a later date. Sometimes, in fact, with certain charities, larger charities in particular, they will pay for your attorney's fees to establish this trust if you irrevocably name that charity as your remainder beneficiaries. Most charities do not do that, but there are a few who are willing to do that. And they run through the calculations and figure out whether it's to their benefit to do so. But essentially, the idea here is that when you pass, whatever's left in that charitable remainder trust is going to go to your favorite charity. So there's step 1, step 2, step 3, and step 4. Now let's talk about what are the tax effects of each of these steps? So, step one, the charitable contribution, the transfer of your house to that charitable remainder trust generates a charitable contribution deduction on your income tax return. So not only are you not going to pay income tax from the sale of your house, but you're going to get a tax deduction, a charitable income tax deduction on your tax return for the year in which you create this charitable remainder trust. And typically, if we've maximized the income payouts, the charitable contribution deduction will be approximately 10% of the value of what went in. So if you put a $2 million house in, you'll get a $200,000 charitable contribution deduction, most common. So that's the tax effect of step one, the formation of the trust. Step two, the sale to the third party. That sale is a tax exempt sale, not because of your $500,000 personal residence exclusion from capital gain, but because the charitable remainder trust, which owned the property and was the seller of the property, is a tax exempt entity. Step three, the payment of income to you for life. Your income stream can be structured in a number of different ways, the most prominent of which I've listed here as under item three. The income stream can be structured as an income, in other words, actual income that's earned by the investments inside the trust gets distributed to you. That's usually not the most recommended, most likely to be recommended form because it's unpredictable somewhat, and it's usually not enough. It's hard to generate income in today's investment world, and not a lot of companies are paying 5% income streams. Number two is the income can be structured as an annuity. In other words, a set amount that doesn't change for the rest of your life. So, for example, it could be $100,000 a year every year for the rest of your life. This is also usually not the preferred structure in most cases. In some cases it would be, but in most cases, the preferred structure is something called a unit trust, which is there on your screen, number 3 with the 3 little eyes. A unit trust is a set percentage of the value of the assets in the trust, revalued every year. And that unit trust percentage under the tax code must be at least 5%. So we know it's going to be at least 5%. In most cases, depending on the age of the creators of the trust, the unit trust percentage will be a larger number, 7%, 8%, etc. And so the unit trust percentage says this: if the trust starts out with $2 million of gross proceeds from the sale of the house inside the trust, and it's paying 5%, then that's 5% of $2 million is going to be $100,000. If the value of the assets during year one, if they're invested and the value increases, so that at the beginning of year two, there's $2.2 million inside the trust, then your annuity or your unit trust payment in year two will also go up. So it'll be $110,000. If, however, the value has gone down to $1.8 million because the stock market didn't perform or for whatever reason, then your distribution from the CRT will also go down. So it'll only be $90,000 instead of $100,000. So the value of the unit trust structure is that you're never going to deplete the assets by reason of a distribution. And so most commonly, we structure these trusts as unit trust interests because we know you're going to get a fair rate of return, quote unquote, on your assets inside that trust. In other words, the trust will distribute to you a set percentage of whatever those assets value will be at that time. And then finally, the fourth method is something called a NIMCRUT, which stands for Net Income Makeup Charitable Remainder Unit Trust. I'm not going to get into the details of that because we don't have enough time, and it's a little bit complex to be explaining in this format. But suffice it to say, that is a method that allows us to defer taking payments. So let's say I am 55 years old and I don't want to start taking income payments from this thing until I turn 60. I can structure the trust as a NIMCRUT, or what we call a flip NIMCRUT, which is another variation on that. And it can allow me to delay taking my distributions until I reach age 60. And then distributions will start coming out. And the advantage of that is I can invest the funds, the gross proceeds, but because I'm taking no distributions, the funds are growing inside this charitable remainder trust. And so when I do start taking distributions when I turn 60, my distributions are going to be larger. That's a very common structure that we'll commonly use, where we defer taking distributions until we feel like we need those distributions. So that's step 3, the tax and cash flow benefits of that technique. In step 4 is when I die. When I die, whatever's left in that charitable remainder trust goes to charity. Now, how is that a good thing? Well, it's a good thing, number one, if you're philanthropically inclined, you have a charity that you would like to benefit, but it's also, there's a tax benefit from that, because any assets inside, even though you were getting this income stream during your lifetime, any assets remaining at your death are not going to be subject to estate tax at your death because they're going to charity. So you get an additional charitable tax deduction, but this time it's a charitable estate tax deduction. Therefore, whatever's left in that charitable remainder trust will not be subject to estate tax when you pass. Okay? That is the fourth tax benefit of this technique. Now, you might be saying, well, gee, David, that's all fine and good, but didn't I just reduce my estate by $2 million? Didn't I just take assets out of my pocket, out of my bank account, and put them into a charitable entity that I only get limited benefit from? And that is correct. And one should only consider using this technique when one is charitably inclined, philanthropically inclined, because you may or may not be better off by having done this. But surprisingly enough, you can actually, if we run the calculations, in many cases, you can actually be better off by having created a charitable remainder trust than if you had not created a charitable remainder trust. And let me explain how that works. This is a very, very crude illustration of the assets that you have in your pocket by creating a charitable remainder trust versus the assets you have in your pocket when you don't create a charitable remainder trust. In this example, let's assume that you sell your house for $1 million and you pay income taxes, capital gain taxes on the sale of that house. So you start out with somewhere between $600,000 and $700,000. That's represented by this teal color. The top line here, I think you can see my cursor there. So that top line that starts at about $650,000, that's the proceeds that you have left after you pay your taxes from the sale of your house. And then you reinvest those proceeds, and the proceeds grow at some rate. And you'll notice that the rate that this dollars in your pocket line increases is a pretty flat line. And the reason it's flat is because you're paying taxes as you go. Whereas when you create a charitable remainder trust, though you're taking $1 million in this example out of your bank account and putting it in the bank account of the charitable trust, and so you're only getting the benefit of the charitable income tax deduction to start with, because you're getting these annual distributions, and the distributions potentially can grow and not pay taxes on the investments. It's almost like an IRA where you're not paying taxes on the gains on your investments inside the CRT, and you're not paying taxes until you take distributions. So the assets in your pocket grow at a steeper rate than they can grow when you invest net outside of the charitable remainder trust. So it's a steeper line here. And the way this works is at some point, the line representing the dollars in your pocket or in your bank account from creating a charitable remainder trust and the dollars in your pocket when you don't create a charitable remainder trust will cross because of the difference in the slope of those lines. And the question is always going to be, at what point will they cross? And no one knows. And the reason no one knows is we don't know what rates of return you're going to be able to get inside the charitable remainder trust, nor do we know what rates of return you're going to get outside the charitable remainder trust. Similarly, we don't know what the income tax rate is going to be 10 or 15 years from now. And so we don't know what the slope of either of these lines is going to look like. But we know that we can have a steeper line with the CRT than we can without the CRT. And so if you live long enough, you will break even. And the question is, will you live long enough? And if you talk to your financial advisor and or your CPA, your financial advisor and your CPA can do some illustrations for you, some cash flow illustrations, showing you the effects of the various different variables of tax rates and rates of return on investments and so forth. And can give you some what ifs that will give you a good idea of where that break even point might be in your particular situation. So, as I've indicated in this graph, you can see that if you die prior to the break even point, it says you lose. Well, did you really lose? Well, you didn't really lose. You benefited charity more than you benefited yourself. But if you die after that break even point, not only did you benefit charity, but you actually personally got more benefit by having created the CRT than had you not. And so, again, I would advise you to talk to your CPA, your financial advisor, and or your lawyer about whether a CRT makes sense for you. And I'd be happy to talk to anyone who has questions about that. My contact information is here. Thank you, Jackie.
Great. This is so valuable and information that as much as I knew some about CRD, but not to this extent, and it was extremely valuable. So again, for the viewers who would like to get hold of you, what is the best way to get hold of you?
Yes, I'm with the law firm of Berliner Cohen. Our main office is in San Jose. We are at 10 Almaden Boulevard, Suite 1100 in San Jose. That's 95113. My email address is david.spence, S-P-E-N-C-E, at Berliner, BERLINER.com. And my telephone number is area code 408-286-5800, and you can just ask for me.
Great. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, David. And this has been so valuable, and I'm certain a lot of people will be reaching out to you for further explanation and getting the process started.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jackie.